Starting time period for part 2, looking at gunpowder empires, so looking at Middle Eastern empires, looking at what's been going on in China, and looking at how European exploration turns a little bit more into colonization. And that's how we're going to end, and then we're going to look at what happens to those colonies when they want independence. We've talked about the gunpowder empires a bit, not much. I mentioned how the Middle Eastern empires were huge land empires that were part of the reason that the Europeans sailed in the ocean and in the sea rather than now trying to trade overland, because these empires are going to be extremely powerful, and they're also going to be extremely influential in not only this region but for everyone. So when looking at the gunpowder empires, you can see here we have, this is the Ottoman Empire. So the Ottoman Empire takes a lot of territory that you guys are familiar with. Egypt, the Levant right here, Anatolia or Asia Minor, the Balkan Peninsula, and then land on the Arabian Peninsula. So they're the closest to Europe. We're going to see a lot of interactions between them and Europe. They're going to last all the way until World War I. So they're very influential. The middle one is the Safavid Empire. This is going to be more of a Persian-based empire, very significant. We'll talk about them in class. And then finally, the Mughal Empire. The Mughal Empire is an Islamic empire that takes over the large portion of northern India. So we're going to talk about the influence there. In terms of what they all have in common, the gunpowder empires in general refer to the larger Islamic states that relied on firearms that they got from China to conquer and control territory. So that's why they're called the gunpowder empires. They're all land-based empires. They did get involved in trade a little bit, but it's mostly land-based trade rather than sea-based trade. So if you ever see a question on a test comparing land-based empires to sea-based empires, you would be looking at these gunpowder empires as your land-based empires, and you'd be looking at European empires as the more sea-based empires. They're going to take a lot of advantage of the power vacuum that comes when the Mongols fall. Russia is not going to be considered a gunpowder empire because they tried to modernize more like Western Europe. They wanted that sea trade, they wanted all the palaces, so we looked at how Russia advanced, and these empires are going to advance a little bit differently. In terms of Mongol rule and how the gunpowder empires got their power back, the Mongol rule in Central Asia is going to fall apart much like all the others. When Genghis Khan dies, Kublai Khan dies, all of these Mongol leaders are going to die, and he didn't set up a lasting government system. So when that power vacuum comes, we're going to see different leaders try to take advantage of that. We do see a little bit of violence when the Mongol rule falls apart, and we start to see these Islamic powers wanting the region back, because you guys learned how Mongol rule kind of disrupted that Islamic power and culture that was advancing. So we also see them encouraging to become educated again, to promote artwork. We see 3 major Islamic gunpowder empires based off of nomadic tribes, often allowing religious tolerance, and they didn't modernize like the West did. So we're going to look at the Ottomans, the Safavid, and the Mughal empires. And for homework, you're going to take notes on the Ottoman Empire. You can see how long it lasted, which is pretty cool. Lasts all the way until World War I. So this is the Ottoman Empire. So you can see the amount of territory that they have, which is extremely significant. So the Ottoman Empire is going to be contemporary to existing when the Byzantine Empire exists, and we'll talk about how they take them out. The Ottoman Empire is going to be such a prominent force when Peter the Great is ruling over Russia, and when Louis XIV is ruling over France, and when Columbus is sailing to the Americas. So the Ottoman Empire takes a large portion of this middle part of the world. And they're going to encompass lands in the Middle East, Northern Africa, Eastern Europe. It's the most long-lived post-Mongol Muslim empire. The Ottoman Empire was founded circa 1300, when the Mongol rule is going to fall apart, by Osman. That's his Western name, Osman. Some people call him Uthman the First. He was a Turk, a nomadic Turk from Anatolia. He's going to take control of the Dardanelles Strait, giving him major advantage of controlling trade, the link between Europe and Asia, and the link between pretty much the Mediterranean Sea and the Black Sea. And he creates a powerful army that included both traditional skills of Turkish cavalrymen, who are used to being nomadic, and a lot of new military tactics using Chinese gunpowder, like using artillery, using cannons, a lot of stuff that the Mongols brought to the Middle East from East Asia when they conquer those regions. So that's another effect that you see of the Mongols coming in. It's going to create and set up these gunpowder empires. They're going to first concentrate on fighting Christians, and in 1389 they're going to fight a battle of Kosovo, where they defeat the Eastern Orthodox Serbian kingdom, gain control of the Balkans and the Mediterranean region, and that gives them a foothold in Europe. So we see other sultans. Sultan is the name for an Ottoman leader. We see other sultans working to expand the empire, and one of the most significant was Sultan Mehmed II. He's known as the Conqueror. He was obsessed with getting the city of Constantinople. He called it the jewel of his empire. And so he wanted to work on conquering the Byzantine Empire, and he's successful in 1453. He ends the Byzantine Empire, gets control of Constantinople, renames it to Istanbul, and it becomes such a symbol of this time period for these rulers in the gunpowder empires. It's going to be one of the most beautiful cities. You can compare it to how Peter the Great built St. Petersburg, how Louis built Versailles. Mehmed's really going to try to make major advancements, build and expand on aqueducts. The Hagia Sophia, which was the church, is going to become a mosque. He builds another mosque, several mosques, mansions, religious schools, hospitals, rest houses for people who are coming in and trading in the Ottoman Empire. So Istanbul is going to become like the hub of the Ottoman Empire. And then another sultan is going to conquer Egypt and Syria in the 1500s, around when Cortez is going to the New World. One of the main leaders that you need to know is Suleiman the Magnificent. He's a little bit prior to Peter the Great and Louis XIV. So he's going to be more in line with the years of like Queen Elizabeth ruling, more in that time period, the Tudor family. He ruled during the golden age of the Ottoman Empire, and he's going to carry out the largest assault on Christian Europe since the first Islamic empires. Especially like since we see during the Crusades, we're going to see things like that. So he conquers the majority of the Balkans and the island of Rhodes, and he's going to even move up into Austria and try to attack Vienna. He was forced to retreat because winter was coming on, but he fought with Venice for control of the Mediterranean, and Venice eventually was forced to pay tribute or taxes to the Ottomans. He tried to break Portugal's control over the Indian Ocean, but Portugal had such a firm control on the Indian Ocean trade routes at this time that they only gained the port of Aden and the Red Sea shipping. So if you can look here, it's kind of hard to see, but that's near the Arabian Peninsula. So modern-day Oman and Yemen, he kind of is reaching towards that area to have a little access to the Indian Ocean. But they're not as successful in the sea, and that's why they are more of a land-based empire. By the 1520s, the Ottoman Empire was the most powerful, the best organized state in Europe, the Islamic world. It's the most advanced and most powerful at the time. Istanbul was this cosmopolitan city. The Sultan, the ruler, was seen as a combination of a warrior prince, a Turkic warrior prince, a Muslim caliph, and a conquering empire. And you could technically call these sultans absolute monarchs, just like Louis XIV. Their language is a mixture of Turkic, Arabic, and Persian. Population was primarily Muslim, but they did have a lot of other religions living in the Ottoman Empire. So they did have some Christians, they had some Jews. These other religious people are known as dhimmis. So they were allowed to worship their own religion, but they had to pay that jizya, the tax. They had a lot of Christian and Jewish merchants in the Ottoman Empire because trading was so important to them. And so we see a little bit of religious tolerance in the Ottoman Empire. The only thing that we see is that Sunni Islam is going to be more prominent. So we're going to see a few conflicts between Sunni and Shia Islam. And we're going to see how they conflict with the Safavid Empire, which was Shia. In terms of economics, you guys are going to be looking at documents based on this part, so make sure you write this down. They're going to control the Dardanelles Strait and northern Africa, the Gold Coast, the slave trade. So here's the Dardanelles. So it's going to give access to the Black Sea, access to the Mediterranean Sea, and it connects Europe to Asia. And this is why Constantinople was put there in the first place. And that's why Mehmed II really wanted Istanbul there. They forced people in occupied areas to pay tribute, to pay a tax, which is similar to a lot of other regions at this time. They're going to allow traders to serve as middlemen to increase their own wealth. And the middle class is going to be regulated by a lot of guilds, just like in Europe. We see a tolerance of Christians and Jewish traders in exchange for that foreign tax on dhimmis. They're going to sign a lot of trade agreements with Europe, specifically because Europe is going to want a lot of their products. So they're going to bring in spices from the East Indies, ivory from Africa, forest products from Russia, carpets from Persia, and they're going to trade all of that in a land-based empire and a lot with Europe. The main product that we see coming from the Ottoman Empire is coffee. So if you're a coffee drinker, this is where we see the prominence of coffee coming into history. It became so popular due to interaction with the Americas, with the Columbian Exchange, and coffee houses in the Ottoman Empire are going to be really, really almost like modern day coffee houses where you have people going there to discuss topics, to study, to create advancements. We see them playing music. It's places for meetings to happen, gossip, people to play chess and hang out. So coffee houses are going to be extremely, extremely important in the Ottoman Empire, and we're going to see that eventually spread into Europe, that same influence. In terms of government, an example of absolutism would be the position of the Sultan and the palaces that they built and the rule that they had over their people. And then one thing they do to control groups of people around them is called the Devshirme. And the Devshirme is where Christian boys in the empire are recruited by force to serve either in the government or the military, sometimes directly used for the Sultan. A lot of times they're put into the military. And they converted to Islam when they became a part of this Devshirme system, and they were educated by the Ottomans. So what's interesting is, even though it's a system of forcing people to work for you and to be a part of your empire, a lot of Christian mothers almost encouraged their kids to do this because it was a good opportunity. A lot of them even rose up in society. They became scribes, tax collectors for conquered areas. In terms of the army, Ottoman army was made up of the cavalry, Muslim Turkish cavalry, archers, and a lot of Christian janissaries. Janissary was a prisoner of war where they're originally taken as slaves, but then they become part of the Devshirme system and they get trained to become warriors. So janissaries are almost like forced labor, but in the military. And they're trained as an elite infantry fighting force for the Ottomans. And most of them converted to Islam, weren't allowed to marry, and they trained year-round. Eventually, what's interesting is the janissaries are going to become the most powerful force in the army over the original cavalry. And because of this, they're going to control a lot of the artillery, a lot of the firearms. And sultans relied more on the janissaries than they did on the original nobility of the Ottoman Empire. Many of the janissaries even became senior commanding officers in the bureaucracy in the Ottoman Empire. We also see cannons and guns play a large role in land battles, and that's why we call these the gunpowder empires. In terms of society, these are some of their social classes. So the sultans are the absolute rulers, the leaders. They had viziers, almost their bureaucracy, their advisors. There was a warrior aristocracy, a nobility that competed with scholars for roles in the government. The Janissaries are going to become extremely powerful in the military. They had a middle class of merchants and artisans. Peasants, almost all were placed into serfdom. And then they did have a system of slavery where they had prisoners of war, and they were used for the military a lot. In terms of tolerance, we do see they have tolerance towards other religions, but those other religions do have to pay taxes to worship freely. We start to see the Ottomans having a bit of a crisis. In terms of economics, they didn't have the wealth that matched European economic advancements. It's going to put their merchants at a lot of disadvantage, and they're not going to be able to compete with the Europeans in the sea trade. A lot of cheap silver was coming from the Americas, and it caused inflation around the world that even impact the Ottoman Empire. And we see that the Ottomans can't keep up with the exploration that the Europeans are doing. Then their military starts to decline. Janissaries force the Sultan to drop the ban against marriages. We see the Janissaries getting even a bit more power. They began to engage in business and trade on their own, and they're going to increase their role in the economy, which weakens them as a military force. We see a couple battles that the Ottomans fight against the Europeans. The Battle of Lepanto in 1571, where they're defeated by Spain and Venice over dominance of the Mediterranean, and it completely ends Ottoman naval influence. And in 1683, a second siege of Vienna that they put on Vienna failed because the Janissaries were not as focused as they were before. Then in terms of politics, the Sultan becomes a little bit more isolated. The viziers are going to gain more power over affairs of the government. We see a rise of tax farming. Administrators are paid a set tax amount, or they pay a set tax amount to the government in advance in return for collecting a greater amount from the actual taxpayers. Law and order and agricultural production are going to decline in rural areas. We see the power decentralized as Istanbul loses control of its expansive empire. Regional governors, wealthy landowners, and nomadic chiefs are going to start ruling their provinces independently rather than listening to the Sultan. And then we also start to see a tulip period, a time period of about 10 years in which the Ottoman elite in Istanbul start to emulate European styles and attitudes as their empire declines. So we see that they almost turn to a point where they want to become more westernized and moved away from traditional Ottoman traditions. In terms of globalism and how they fit into the bigger world picture at this time, the Ottomans inherited from their predecessors the thought that little of what happened in Europe was important to them. And this prevented them from taking seriously all of the changes that were going on in the West and seeing the West as being powerful. These ideas of reforms were blocked by conservatives, by Janissaries, and so the Ottomans simply were not advancing as much as the Europeans at the time period. Their use of gunpowder that gave them power is eventually no longer going to be significant when other advancements overcome that. So we're going to see them lasting. They're going to carry on to other time periods, and we'll continue to talk about them, and we'll talk about their fall during World War I.